Okay, well, maybe let's begin.
Okay.
What do you think? So welcome everyone who's here and streaming in. Um, this is the third installment of this BGC-Argo webinar series, co-hosted by GO-BGC and US OCB. So this webinar will be, I think, the first of two that will be focused on using BGC-Argo float data to investigate chemical and biological processes in the ocean that are influenced by weather and extreme events. We think we'll be following this one up in a few months with another on the same topic. And so what we'll do today is first we'll hear an update on the status of the GO-BGC float array from Yui. And then we'll hear two talks from Jakob Weis and Magdalena Carranza on this topic of using floats to study weather and extreme events. I should introduce myself as well. I'm John Sharp. I'm a postdoc at UW-Seacoast and NOAA PMEL. And some of my work involves using data from BGC-Argo floats. And so I think we will be monitoring the chat throughout the few presentations for any questions that anyone might have. And we will have a discussion at the end where we can address some of those questions. And if folks are interested, they can also raise their hand, unmute themselves, and ask questions that way as well. So with that, if I'm not forgetting anything, I think I'll turn it over to Yui to give a quick update on the status of the GO-BGC array.
Cool. Great. Thanks, John. And I just want, so Channing Pratt and Yevon Huang are also online here, and they are, they are helping organize this webinar series as well. And Allison Gray and Lynn Talley are also on the organizing committee. So just, lots of, everyone chips in, and that's what makes this possible. So thank you to everyone on the organizing committee. So yeah, I'm going to give a quick introduction. So this is going to be, the same kind of information for every webinar. So I'm going to quickly go through this. But just as a reminder, BGC-Argo is a part of the One Argo vision of maintaining 4,700 profiling floats globally, which is consisting of 2,500 core floats, 1,200 deep floats, and 1,000 BGC floats. And so this is a figure of what that array would look like. And the number of 1,000 BGC floats was determined through various studies such as OSCEs. And if you want the details, you can find it in the Biogeochemical Argo Science and Implementation Plan here. And so I want to mention, and just to make it very clear to everyone that the data from BGC-Argo floats are all freely available. And most of them are QC'd. And then there are multiple access points, and the main one that we would like to direct people to is the Argo GDAC, and then specifically these S profiles. These are called synthetic profiles, where the BGC float BGC data have been merged with the core data, so it's on a single pressure axis. And we have developed a BGC-Argo toolbox as well, which is available in MATLAB, R, and Python. And they are all available on GitHub, and there are YouTube videos on how to use this Argo toolbox, and I think the links will appear in the chat sometime soon. And there are also data snapshots available on the GO-BGC website. There you can access them through the data and access and visualizations. And then these data snapshots have DOIs attached with them, and we also provide derived carbon parameters, so PCO2, DIC, and particulate organic carbon. But we only do these for floats that are involved in the SOCOM and GO-BGC programs. But the point is, data are freely available, and so please use them. The data is for you. And so the target BGC-Argo array of 1,000 floats, the hypothetical array would look something like this. And currently, we have about 250, there are over 450 operational floats with at least one BGC sensor on them. And there are 251 that have at least 4 of these sensors, which include oxygen, nitrate, pH, chlorophyll A fluorescence, backscatter, and downwelling irradiance. The GO-BGC program was funded to deploy 500 profiling floats around the world. It is funded by NSF and through the mid-scale research infrastructure project. And so we are in year 2 of this program, and we have deployed over 64 floats now. The location is shown in the yellow dots. And then since the last webinar, we have deployed a couple floats in the Gulf of Alaska and some additional ones in the North Atlantic. And we have we have 133 float deployments that are planned for the next year, and the location is shown in these colored dots. So I kind of want to, and this is a combination of both GO-BGC and SOCOM floats. And so I kind of want to pay, direct attention to there. We're going to be deploying quite a bit of BGC floats in the Indian Ocean. So this provides a good opportunity to study BGC processes in the Indian Ocean, because as you can see, there are no floats in there right now. Additionally, there are over 250 floats from international partners over the next 5 years. The contributing countries are shown on the right. And in general, from our understanding, our international partners are focusing deployments in these yellow areas, but I don't know where the exact deployment plans are yet. Okay, a couple quick updates on BGC-Argo and GO-BGC programs. There is a new sensor, the Seabird 83, which is an oxygen optode that can do both air calibration and has the benefit of having a fast response time because it is in the pumped flow stream. So this will have fast response times and also get the accuracy of the air calibration each time it comes to the surface. Additionally, Seabird has developed a multispectral fluorometer where the excitation wavelengths are both 435 and 470. And so the benefit of this is that chlorophyll A fluorescence, chlorophyll A absorbs more strongly at 435 rather than 470. So we hope that this will lead to a better proxy for chlorophyll A concentration. So those are 2 sensor updates. And so just kind of I want to come back to this. Again, data for all this is freely available, so please use it and do some great science. One thing that I would want to add is that although the data are QC'd with defined protocols, there are still some caveats to the data sets, and such as the response time of oxygen from Andera sensors are not corrected for a slow sensor response. So that would lead to systematic low bias in oxyclines. And then so when you use the data, make sure that you read the relevant literature before you use them. And we are trying to aggregate this information on our data FAQs page on the GO-BGC website. So please take a look at this. And if you have any suggestions on what information you would want included on this FAQ page, please email us. The email address is here, GO-BGC-OCB-webinar@listserver.mbari.org, and I'll add that in the chat. Okay. With that, I am going to pass it on to Jake.
Excellent.
I can give you a quick intro first, Jake.
Sure.
And I also wanted to say, Yui, thanks for that update. And I was really excited to see that there's now snapshots of the BGC-Argo database that are available, which I think is fairly new. That's very exciting to me. So yeah, I'll introduce Jake. Jake is a PhD student at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in Hobart, Tasmania in Australia. And he's going to be talking to us today about using BGC-Argo floats to study phytoplankton blooms stimulated by the 2019 to 2020 Australian bushfires. Take it away, Jake.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, and also thanks to the organizers for inviting me to talk to this. It's an exciting study, and I guess the main take-home message I want to make this talk is how extremely valuable BGC-Argo floats are for studying extreme events like those. And I guess the 2 case studies that I'm presenting in this talk are a great example of why that is the case. So on the right here, we see a beautiful snapshot from the Himawari 8 satellite, which is a geostationary satellite from Japan, perfectly located to show here in January, on the 6th of January 2020, Australia located here, and big smoke plumes coming off of the bushfires. So they were visible from space. And yes, let's get right into it. The Australian bushfires in 2019, 2020, I'm sure everyone will have followed the news and heard how devastating they were, but just in a couple of figures. In total, during the bushfires, 7.5 million hectares of native bushland were burnt, which equates to an area of roughly 2.5 times the state of Massachusetts. A total of 715 million tons of carbon dioxide were emitted, which equates to roughly 1.5 times the amount of carbon dioxide emitted by Australia in 2021. And most relevant to these studies, an unprecedented amount of aerosols came off of the bushfires and went into the atmosphere. And shown down here in this little animation is atmospheric black carbon, or the black carbon aerosol optical depth taken from the chemistry analysis. And we see those aerosols were emitted along the east coast of Australia, where the epicenter of the fires was located. And these aerosols were injected high up into the atmosphere by winds generated by those fires. And from there, they were carried by the westerly winds straight over the southern hemisphere into remote parts of the Southern Ocean. And in some cases, if you look closely, like right now, we've got the main aerosol emission event, these aerosols come back and have circumnavigated the globe. So this is just showing how massive these emission events were. And to show it in another figure, taken from this initial study that we conducted, led by Yui, Tang, and Joan Yort, we see, I'm sorry, I just realized, I'm having a wrong version of my slides here. Well, anyway, I'll just go with those. They're basically the same. I just changed them. We see here this figure of the December to February anomaly of black carbon aerosols in the atmosphere from 2019 to 2020 as an anomaly relative to the climatology. And we see that in this region, we calculated a time series of black carbon aerosols. And during the bushfires, these aerosols exceeded the climatology by roughly 1 order of magnitude during its peak. So it was a significant amount of aerosols that reached this remote part of the Southern Ocean. And we further collected aerosol samples in Tasmania, which was located under the smoke plumes. And these samples were analyzed for a component called levoglucosan, which is a tracer for biomass burning. And it was further analyzed for iron concentration. And we found that where levoglucosan was high, meaning that these aerosols were impacted by bushfire ash, also total iron and, more importantly, labile iron concentrations were high. And labile iron is very soluble, and that's what is necessary for phytoplankton to be able to consume it and be fertilized by it. So we then looked at ocean color retrievals from the MODIS Aqua ocean color satellite from NASA, and found that in 2 regions downwind of Australia of the fires, these big patches of highly anomalous surface chlorophyll concentrations came up after the bushfires. And looking again at a time series of this, we find that during the bushfire period, these chlorophyll concentrations reached an anomalous maximum that also occurred during the seasonal minimum, showing again how anomalous these blooms were. And so these observations drew a very compelling picture of how the bushfires likely fertilized the ocean. But on their own, these observations were lacking some evidence, and this evidence we brought in from BGC-Argo floats, which raised the impact of the study by quite a bit. And the Argo floats we brought in mainly for two reasons. One was to provide concrete and in situ evidence that the regions that were blooming were iron limited and thus fertilized by the iron brought in. Excuse me. And secondly, we used observations from Argo floats to ground truth the indirect observations that we previously had only from satellites. And for this, we mainly used two sensors and three parameters: the nitrate sensor, the backscatter, and chlorophyll sensor. And we mainly observed 4 regions in the Southern Ocean: the Great Australian Bight, the South of Australia, the East Australian Current, the South Pacific Gyre, and the main bloom region, the Pacific Southern Ocean. I'm going to walk you through how we use those floats. First of all, we used nitrate sensors to show that the blooming regions were limited in iron. And the way this works is the Southern Ocean is a high nutrient, low chlorophyll region, which means that it has very high concentrations of the macronutrient nitrate, which is mainly due to the fact that the micronutrient iron, which phytoplankton requires in low amounts, but it does require it, iron is basically non-existent down here. And that's why nitrate is high. So a region with high nitrate concentration is iron limited and susceptible to iron fertilization. So taking floats in each of these 4 regions, which all receive bushfire aerosols at some point, showed us that the Pacific Southern Ocean down here and the Great Australian Bight had nitrate concentrations elevated above 1 millimole per meter cubed, which leads us to believe that these regions are not limited in nitrate and therefore limited by micronutrients, and mainly iron in that case. Whereas the EAC, the East Australian Current, and the South Pacific Gyre, those during the peak of the bushfire starting around November, those were very low in nitrate, and thus showing us these are likely not that iron limited and therefore not that susceptible to the iron supplied by the aerosols. So this was a great way of showing, bringing up in situ evidence that these bloom regions were limited in iron, whereas others that didn't respond weren't. And then to the second use of Argo floats, we were ground truthing the satellite observations taken indirectly from space. And up here in the top row, we see float observations. In the bottom row, we see satellite observations from MODIS Aqua. And in the left-hand column, we see backscatter data, and in the right-hand column, chlorophyll data. Backscatter data is an indicator for biomass, biogenic particles, basically in the surface water column. And phytoplankton carbon down here is linearly derived from backscatter, from satellite backscatter. So those are kind of interchangeable. And we see that during the peak fire period shown down here is a gray bar, that both floats and satellites show an increase in biogenic particles during the peak fire season. And similarly, looking at chlorophyll, we see that both the 3 floats in the Pacific Southern Ocean bloom region and the satellite climatology, the satellite observations calculated over the same region are showing this anomalous increase above the climatologies. I forgot to mention this. These climatologies in BGC-Argo time series are calculated from Argo measurements in preceding years. So yeah, this is an Argo-derived climatology, and this is a satellite-derived climatology. Looking at chlorophyll and backscatter separately is giving us an indication of an increase or a change in biomass. But one can also combine these two parameters. And by calculating the ratio of chlorophyll to backscatter, we get a physiological response from phytoplankton, which is due to cellular pigmentation. So where chlorophyll or a backscatter change at differing rates, we can infer that the intracellular pigmentation, the amount of chlorophyll within each cell, changes on a community-wide scale. And this is further being connected to fertilization, to changes in nutrient availability. So where there's low nutrients available, intracellular pigmentation is generally lower than when nutrient stress is being relieved. And this can be shown as an increase in this ratio. And when we're looking at these time series, it's a little more variable in the float plots, but we see clear anomalies that coincide with the satellite observed chlorophyll to phytoplankton carbon anomalies. And yeah, so we see that during the fertilization event and the bloom, that this anomaly of chlorophyll to C-phyto increases, which is showing us an accumulation of pigments within cells throughout this bloom period. So that was a cool observation as well. And I'd go back quickly. You might realize that the peak of the bushfires was roughly from November to the end of February, but the bloom response and the physiological anomalies lasted for quite a while longer. So this was another big question that had to be addressed in a follow-up study. And if we're also up here in this top panel, we're looking at black carbon deposition flux. So how much actually reached the surface of the Pacific Southern Ocean bloom. We see that in this period from March onwards, the fires had mostly been contained at that point. So the aerosol deposition went down drastically. And during the same time period, looking at float and satellite retrievals of bloom parameters, we see that despite the reduction in aerosols and therefore iron supply from aerosols, the bloom response was still there. And essentially what we found was that this prolonged bloom response was to a large extent due to recycling within the bloom, which in the case of the South Pacific bloom was largely owing to its massive extent. Because during iron fertilization experiments, blooms are mostly constrained in time by the dilution at the patch edges. But given how massive this bloom was, the dilution during its peak was rather small, and therefore it was able to run on its own iron for quite a while, which is what we discuss in this study if you want to follow up on this. So the take-home messages, I'm just going to skip through those, but I want to end this talk by going back to the theme of the webinar: extreme events. By definition, they are unusual and unexpected, and this means that we rarely target them during field campaigns because we just don't know they happen fast enough. And especially in this case, where the study region is located several thousand miles in the open ocean, yeah, it's impossible to go out there in time and measure what's happening. And this is why floats, which profile continuously in pretty much every part of the ocean by now, are such an invaluable source in these extreme event studies. And also the fact that they are freely available and we can just download them whenever we need them. And yeah, many of the conclusions that we drew in those two studies would not have been possible without the BGC-Argo array. So it's a great resource. And I hope these studies and my presentations have showed that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Jake. I think that's a great point that you made at the end about the importance of these floats, especially relevant to the GO-BGC project, as we're trying to get as many floats out in the global ocean as possible, so we won't have to kind of try to target extreme events, but we'll already have these platforms there and profiling and sampling where we need them to be. Yeah,
it's amazing.
Okay, great. Well, I think we have a few questions in the chat, but I think what we're going to do is let Magdalena go and give her talk first, and then come back to all these questions for our discussion at the end. So yeah, Jake, you can keep your slides handy because I think we'll probably want to get them back on the screen at the end. But I will introduce Magdalena, who is a postdoc at the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. And she's going to talk to us about the role of storms for air-sea CO2 exchange in the Southern Ocean.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my slides well?
Yep.
Okay. Oops. Yeah, so I'm a postdoc fellow at MBARI these days, but today I'm going to present work that I got started during my previous postdoc experience at NCAR with Matt Long, looking at the community Earth system model. And these days I've incorporated some BGC-Argo flow data to the analysis to investigate the role of storms for air-sea CO2 exchange in the Southern Ocean. So a lot of what we've learned of air-sea CO2 exchange in the Southern Hemisphere pre-SOCOM area came from this type of ocean and climate model simulations that I'm using here to illustrate, that I borrowed from the Eco-Darwin project to illustrate how these sort of weather patterns can modify the air-sea CO2 flux exchange between the ocean and the atmosphere. And we knew pre-SOCOM that there was a lot of discrepancy in these models in terms of what the fluxes are doing in each season, and a lot of these uncertainties may be coming from weather patterns like this that would leave a large imprint in the upper ocean, and integrated over space and time may be adding errors to the mean seasonal fluxes. So we wanted to look at this. The focus of the study today is on the extratropical storms in the Southern Hemisphere. And I was saying that you might expect this will leave a very large imprint in the upper ocean, and perhaps this would, in terms of grid resolution, would be well represented in the models. But there's a lot of challenges of, still for the modeling community to get these events right, because they will challenge all the parameterizations, like the gas transfer velocity that does matter for the air-sea CO2 gas exchange. So these aren't like hurricane, these aren't such extreme events like hurricanes in the tropical latitudes, but they are still very frequent and they are active year-round. So we were trying to understand what are storms doing in the upper ocean, leveraging the modeling work on the community Earth system model. and also adding some observational perspective from the BGC-Argo floats. So the model where I'm using is just a very simple configuration, a forced ocean run of this CSM. And for those familiar with this type of models, it's the run that was used to initialize the decadal prediction large ensemble that I essentially cloned to get more biogeochemical field output on daily scales to be able to run this analysis. So the approach was to track storms in sea level pressure, atmospheric sea level pressure, as minima in sea level pressure, and follow these storms and extract the region of the ocean or the volume of ocean beneath the storm and do composite analysis to get a sense of what's the mean imprint of a storm in the model. But also doing some similar analysis can be done if we look at the SOCOM profile, the float profiles that sample areas within storm centers and aggregate them in sort of meaningful ways. So with the SOCOM flows, we have that measure pH, temperature, and salinity. We can make some inferences on the partial pressure of CO2 in the ocean, and combined with atmospheric reanalysis data, we can also potentially say something about the RC-CO2 fluxes. So before I go into the results of this study, I thought that it would be important to give a little bit of an overview of what we've learned from this type of systems, cyclonic systems in the tropical latitudes, because there are a lot more studies over there. And so what do we expect? How do we expect storms or hurricanes to change the RC-CO2 flux from the atmosphere to the ocean, the RC-CO2 exchange? And so we know that the fluxes are parameterized with a gas transfer coefficient that has a wind dependence. And then there's this also the direction is set by the difference in the partial pressure of CO2 between the ocean and the atmosphere. And for tropical cyclone studies, we know these cyclones can reach hurricane force winds. So there's a big influence on the wind speed, a big influence of the wind speed through this gas transfer coefficient. But there's also these storms are so powerful that they can produce very significant changes in ocean PCO2, and the atmospheric partial pressure of CO2 changes only by a small fraction. So from these studies, essentially the observations have shown that, most of these storms tend to produce outgassing, and, the contribution to the summertime summertime RC-CO2 flux can range from 1% to 100%, depending on what hurricane or what observations we're taking at the time. But essentially, what they find, there's also big changes in ocean PCO2, and these are mostly driven in these latitudes by the thermal component. So this is a surface cooling effect that you might expect from the deep mixing. But we know there's other effects that can change PCO2 in the ocean that may become more important in the southern hemisphere, like the ice entrainment that can increase the PCO2. So there is this one study that I find particularly interesting, because I'm gonna do similar analysis with the CSM model output, and that they've looked at this impact of tropical cyclones on RC-CO2 fluxes using a model and this sort of tracking technique of hurricanes in this case. So the two important things I think to highlight are that these CO2 flux anomalies in the tropics are, there's this wind-driven instantaneous effect from just increasing the wind speed, but it's really dependent on what are the pre-storm conditions, what this wind effect does, right? If there's a hurricane hitting an area where there's already outgassing, then you expect more outgassing. But if there was ingassing, then that wind speed effect will increase the ingassing. So that's a nice, I think, outcome from this study. But there's also an ocean PCO2 change effect that in the tropics, it's thermally driven. So there's this cooling effect that drives a decrease in ocean PCO2. And so both these sort of competing effects in the end tend to sort of cancel each other somehow, or, you know, in large part. And so one of the outcomes of these studies is that the total contribution of the tropical cyclones to this summertime RCCO2 flux is on the order of 5% or less than 10%. But you might imagine that in the Southern Hemisphere, these systems aren't quite, you know, they're active year round, and there's many things that are different, like PCO2 can be potentially driven by the non-thermal component. And these are storms that are very active year round. So I don't know of any studies that have looked at this sort of in a statistical sense, tracking storms or anticyclones in the Southern Hemisphere, but there's this very nice study from recent observations done in the subantarctic zone that came out from wave glider and gliders observations that also carried a microrider that allows to look at the mixing that's happening in the upper ocean. And they were able to, you know, find, you know, look at the storms, at storms in the Southern Ocean, in the subantarctic zone, and how some of these storms, not all, but some of them are able to reverse the sign of the flux from ingassing to outgassing conditions. And these are two examples here. So in these observations, just these two storm events were able to change the mean CO2 flux by 50%. And they look at, you know, some of the mechanisms, and apparently de-icing entrainment can play a major role. So just to summarize, what are the goals of this study is to try and understand what drives storm CO2 outgassing, and I'm sort of anticipating some of our results here. And try also to quantify what's the contribution of storms to Southern Ocean RCCO2 exchange to the annual RCCO2 flux. So in the model, you can see that if you extract the area of the ocean beneath a storm and integrate over all the storms that we have in this 6-year run of the CSM, you see that there's a strong outgassing signal, sort of on the equatorward side of storms, where you expect most of the cooling happening and the mixing. And you can also sort of average spatially each sort of storm impact or the anomaly of the flux and map it to see where the storms are producing most of the outgassing. And you can see that it's mostly all in the subantarctic zone, or this very wide latitudinal band where you can see outgassing happening due to storms, except maybe for those western South Atlantic or the subtropical zones where the anomaly changes sign. But in the model, it's pretty easy to just look at not only, the region of the ocean where the storm is impacting, but also what happened before and after the storm passed. So that's what you're seeing in this plot here on the lower left. So this is anomalies of the CO2 flux segregated by time before and after a storm passed. And so you can see there's this strong outgassing signal in the model that maximizes within a day of a storm's passage. So a similar analysis can be done with the flow data. And so here except some differences in how we compute the anomalies for the flow data. But you can see here, all these are anomalies of the RCCO2 flux inferred from the flows, and not all of these were sampled during storm conditions. Only 30% of these profiles can make it into a plot like this in storm-centric coordinates where, we've sort of searched the profiles that were within a certain radius of a storm center to produce this composite analysis. So we can see that it's encouraging to see that it's the same anomaly, that's at least the same sign, but we see twice as much outgassing in the flow data than in CSM. So we can also look in the flow data into the anomalies before and after a storm passage by looking at the time series of winds before and after a flow profile. And so you can see also this increase in the flux signal of the, order, twice as big as what we had seen in the model. So to try and understand what was what's driving these flux anomalies in the model, we did flux anomaly decomposition to a first order, separating the anomaly into a term that is essentially driven by the gas changes in the gas transfer velocity or the increase in the winds due to the storm passage, and a term that is essentially driven by changes in the delta PCO2 between the ocean and the atmosphere. So that's what you can see here plotted in this plot. So the blue is the term that is the wind effect, that you can see that it's driving more ingassing in the southern hemisphere. And the black line is the term that is essentially driven by changes in the delta PCO2. That, essentially tells us that, yes, high winds seem to be driving more ingassing in the Southern Ocean, but the delta PCO2 change seems to be much more important. And, essentially that's what drives the outgassing signal in the model. So you can further decompose the delta PCO2 anomaly into the anomaly driven by the changes in ocean PCO2 and in atmospheric PCO2. Sorry, in atmospheric, PCO2. And so we can see that's the line in blue is a change in the ocean, which is essentially negligible in the model. And the change in red, you can see the change in the delta in the PCO2, atmospheric PCO2, which is a big drop in the PCO2 atmosphere, which is not surprising given the fact that, the way we track storms or cyclones in general is by changes sea level pressure minima or atmospheric pressure minima. So it seems just the caveat here is that in this version of the model, in this model that is just an ocean run, essentially all the changes in PCO2 atmosphere are driven entirely by the change in atmospheric pressure induced by the storms. So in the model, in the flow data, we can look at a similar decomposition of the delta PCO2 anomalies. And that's what you see here in this plot. And, we do see an increase in the delta PCO2, which is encouraging in the sense that it's the same sign that we see in the model. There's this outgassing signal happening within a day or two of the storm passage. But in the observations, we are able to detect this small increase in PCO2 ocean that we weren't able to look at in the model, to grasp in the model, or it was at least an order of magnitude smaller than in the observations. So I think the other main point here is that unlike the case for tropical cyclones, where these extreme events will induce very large changes in PCO2 ocean that essentially drive the delta PCO2 change, in the southern hemisphere, you see that these changes in PCO2 and this atmosphere and ocean are sort of the same order of magnitude. So we wanted to try and understand what was driving that increase in PCO2 anomalies in the flow data. And so we did this decomposition of the PCO2 anomalies into thermal and non-thermal components. And you can see how, the thermal components drives this decrease in PCO2 ocean. This is shown here by these negative anomalies, as expected from the cooling effect that the storms induce. But the PCO2, the non-thermal component of the PCO2 anomaly in the flow data seems to have a much larger effect, and that's probably better illustrated here in this plot here on the right that shows the same decomposition into thermal and non-thermal components in these sort of days before after storm framework. So the PCO2 anomalies, the red one, and the decrease in PCO2 due to the thermal component in blue, and in yellow, the PCO2 driven by the non-thermal component. And so if you looked at other variables from the flow data, we can see how in the flow data also indicate this increase in mixed layer depths around the storm center. And so you see this deepening of the mixed layer. And it's shown here also in the days before after storm framework. And this is order 10 meters within a day or two of a storm. And this is also corresponds to sea surface temperature cooling effect, and also some increases in the surface DIC anomalies within storms, which suggest some influence of DIC entrainment in the observations. So in the model, there are some changes, that we expect to be happening when you perturb the ocean with a storm. For instance, we see these anomalies in the mixed layer depth, that, the mixed layer can deepen quite rapidly in the model, but it's about an order of magnitude less than what we saw in the flow data. This deepening of the mixed layer happens if you looked at the storm at the upper ocean from above here. This deepening is happening in the same region where we expect the most mixing happening and the cooling happening as well. And so here in the middle panel, you see the SST anomaly, how, when the storm, after the storm, you see this cooling effect. But the cooling happens in the model with a lag, several days after the storm passed. And that cooling, if you just cut across the storm here and look at the depth versus latitude section, you see this cooling happening where we see the deepening of the mixed layers. And there's tiny, some changes, detectable changes in the model in surface DIC anomalies, for instance, that you can see here in the right panel, but these again are lagging. It's a lag response that we see in the model that cannot explain the outgassing signal that we saw. It's mostly driven by the delta PCO2 changes and the PCO2 at the drop in the atmospheric pressure. So we made an attempt to quantify what's the storm's contribution to the Southern Ocean annual CO2 flux, and I'm not going to go into the details of this analysis, but we've compared the size of the anomalies of the storm-induced anomalies in both the SOCOM flow data and the CSM, and compared to the Southern Ocean average fluxes, and compare those anomalies also with the amplitude of the seasonal cycle. And also we use some, storm metric statistics, like what's the typical size of a storm, how long it lasts, and what's the mean area of impact to try and estimate what's the contribution of storms to the annual RC CO2 flux. So I think the point here I want to make is that, all the analyses seem to indicate that in the flow data, this sort of contribution of storms is in the sort of 2 digits of a percent of the total annual Southern Ocean CO2 flux, whereas in the model, this contribution seems to be on the order of 1% or 5%. So overall, I think the main takeaways is first that I think it's important to highlight how even though the floats measure our profile, each float profiles, every 10 days, we can still look at some of these weather events by segregating data in meaningful ways. And we were able to, as more floats go into the water, we will be able to look at seasonality effects of these sort of weather scale phenomena on the upper ocean. But for now, we were able to look at, to essentially show that this both in the CSM and also in the SOCOM flow data, storms seem to be inducing an outgassing signal in the RCCO2 flags that maximizes within a day of a storm. The flows suggest that there's stronger outgassing than that indicated by the model. The mechanisms, though, seem to be different in the model and in the observations. In CSM, the storm-induced RCCO2 flux anomaly is primarily driven by the drop in the atmospheric pressure, while the response of ocean PCO2 is relatively modest and out of phase with a strong outgassing signal that in the model maximizes after 7 days. In the SOCOM flow data, however, we do see an increase in the ocean PCO2 associated to the storms, that it seems to be driven by non-thermal effects and potentially DIC entrainment that happens within a few days of the storm passage. And yeah, overall, I think, we can say with confidence that the magnitude of the storm CO2 flags is in the floats is larger than in the CSM. And perhaps this is something that we need to further investigate and how the models are doing when it comes to representing these phenomena. And I think with that, I will take questions or open the discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Magdalena. And thanks to both of you for a couple fantastic talks. So we have a number of questions in the chat. I guess since you still have your slides up, I'll read this one out from Lynn first for Magdalena. She's asking, can you remind us how you identified storms? What's the threshold, wind speed threshold?
Well, I don't remember out of my, but it's I think maybe 2 hectopascals. We identify the storms as sea level pressure minima and only those closed contours. And I've used Tempest Extremes, which is an algorithm that is out there to do that type of work very easily in any reanalysis data set that was developed by Colin Sarsicki. And we've also done that with the ERA 5 sea level pressure to look at the storms impacts on the flow data. I think if I remember correctly is 2, hectopascals, but I'll look it up and tell you.
All right, let's jump back a little. There are a few questions that were put up during Jake's talk. So first, a couple from Lionel, who asks, was there a lag between the iron deposition and the bloom formation or peak? He's trying to get a sense of how fast the community responds to the iron addition.
So Lionel told me he's out of the meeting, but I'll still answer and send him an email after. I'll just quickly share because I put up a figure for his follow-up question. So regarding this question, in the Tang and Jordanal paper, we stated that the anomalies in chlorophyll followed the peaks in black carbon aerosol optical depth by on the order of days to weeks. So bearing in mind that aerosol optical depth is aerosols in the atmosphere, so there's still the time from being in the atmosphere to deposition. But I guess the response time to the deposition of iron would have been on the order of days to weeks. That's what we assumed here. Yeah, and I think his other question was regarding wait, I don't have the comments right here.
I can read it out here, Jake. It's
Yeah,
if the iron was so efficiently recycled, does that mean that carbon export was not very efficient?
Yeah, so do you see my slide here with the figure?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is a figure from my follow-up study, looking at the long duration of the bloom and hypothesizing that it's recycling. That's a good point, but that's something we cannot easily quantify. So this is basically, yeah, I was trying to calculate the iron budget in the bloom, and this on the left-hand side here is the carbon flux, so net primary production here. And I calculated or estimated export production from it's basically a linear relationship it's a relationship to net primary production that was published by Fan et al. In 2020. So this is the closest estimate I could get in terms of how much was exported. And clearly, if there's more recycling, then the export would decrease. But putting a number to that, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying how much was exported. We can estimate somewhere between 10 and 50% maybe, but that's just of what was produced. But that's a rough estimate, and to estimate that or to approximate that better, we would need to know what kind of phytoplankton grew in the bloom, and if it's diatoms, we could say we can estimate there's probably more export going on because larger cells, they sink faster, but that's knowledge we don't have, and yeah, but it's a good point.
Awesome. Another quick question for Jake from Yibin. He said that from the chlorophyll anomaly indicated from the satellite image, the bloom mainly emerged in the region centered around 120 degrees west. And if the underlying mechanism stimulating the bloom is iron carried by aerosols from the east coast of Australia, why is there no bloom between 160 degrees east and 160 degrees west, which is in the pathway of the aerosols?
Yeah, so I reckon referring to this region, good point. Well, I can only spitball here. I reckon seeing how the subtropical front is dipping down here. This is the fronts are from Orsi et al. So they are, fairly generic locations. I mean, they are accurate, but I reckon this can fluctuate throughout the year over, on larger timescales. So maybe the iron limitation in this region wasn't severe enough for the aerosols to have an impact during that time of the year, during that year. Maybe aerosols weren't deposited as much as here. Much of aerosol deposition relies on wet deposition by precipitation. That could be a reason. It's a peculiar sight, seeing how there's nothing going on here. I think, possibly iron limitation wasn't as severe here as it was here. Another factor to keep in mind is iron solubility increases with transport duration by atmospheric processing. Iron just gets more soluble the further it is carried. So potentially the aerosols that were deposited here weren't as potent as aerosols up here. Could be another reason, but again, this is all from the top of my head.
Cool. I have another question for Magdalena, but since we're at the top of the hour or past, we can definitely kind of do a formal closing and then continue with an informal conversation if you two are still available and if anyone wants to stay on. Does that sound good, Yui? Do you have anything to say as we close the webinar? I assume Yui's still here. Maybe he's not.
All right. What was that?
Oh yeah, there he is. I figured we could just end here, and I'll just say thanks very much to Magdalena and Jake, and thanks to May and Heather from OCB as well. And we are.
I just see a question from Susan. I don't know if we want to address it before we close.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can definitely continue.
Then she's asking, I think the Nicholson et al. 2022 paper found that storm wind driven Marine and Ekman flows were big players in synoptic variability of air CO2 carbon fluxes. Do you see these as well? And I have not addressed that. I have not looked into Ekman flows driven by synoptic variability. There's a lot more work potentially that we can do with the flow data, I guess.
Magdalena, I also
yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Jake.
We're happy to answer any questions by email if more questions. Yeah, there are more questions.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think the recording of this will be posted as well.
Yeah, it'll be on the OCB website, and also there'll be a link from the GO-BGC website as well. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Jake and Magdalena, for great talks. I'm really excited to hear all the cool science that BGC-Argo floats are enabling. And as John said, we'll probably do another extreme event/weather webinar in about 3 months. Date is still TBD. So keep an eye out for OCB emails.
Cool. Thank you all for organizing. That's great.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Bye all.
Thanks everyone for chiming in.